Welcome to Shelf Life. My guest today is Dr. Juanita Coleman-Merritt. We just call her Juana for short. She's an educator who has contributed to the field of education as a bilingual instructor, a program coordinator, and an administrator for many, many years. In addition to publishing many books and articles of her own, she is the program director for the annual literary conference CARICON, which is held in California, and she's the executive director of the Association of Pan-African Doctoral Scholars. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, the author of Lessons from a Starfish, Juanita Coleman-Merritt. Welcome to Shelf Life, where Caribbean authors tell their story. Juana, it's so good to have you right here on Shelf Life with me. I've been looking forward to this for a while. Read Lessons from a Starfish, was absolutely wowed by it.
It's so glad.
Always fascinates me how much life people live that you never know about. So I've known you for a while.
Right.
But so much I learned about you while reading Lessons from a Starfish. And one of the things that I actually learned about you is that you are of mixed parentage, Cuban mother, Jamaican father, born in America. What was that like growing up for you?
Beautiful. Actually, I want to thank you, Judith, for having me, because this is wonderful to be able to share with you and
Thank you.
also our audience. Well, I had a very beautiful, I think I'm very fortunate, I had a very beautiful life. I was I started my life in Harlem, East Harlem to be exact. It was an immigrant community. Most of the immigrants were from Puerto Rico, but a real mix of Cubans, Jamaicans, Dominicans, Trinis, Bajans, everybody. I heard all those accents as a child. And it was fascinating to me, honestly. We had at one point, my parents had a brownstone, and just about everybody that lived in there was a recent arrival from the island, including them. And my mom was born in Santiago de Cuba. And in that area, Oriente in Cuba, there are many Haitians and Jamaicans. Jamaicans come right north. That Guantanamo, the American base, was right there. And Americans like to hire Jamaicans all the way from home because they spoke English. So
that's really interesting to me, because I don't know that I knew that there were so many Jamaicans in Santiago, Cuba.
Yeah. A lot of the families there are mixed. So my family is very mixed with Jamaicans. My mother's mother was born in Jamaica and came as a young person to Cuba. And my father was born in Jamaica and also came to the base to work when he was a teenager. And that's how they met. And so it's a very, very rich background there. And my family has always been bilingual and very used to the diversity of people from the islands. And so in that New York community, it was fascinating, the culture. There was a great big marketplace called the Park Avenue Market, right up the street from where I lived as a really little girl. And they had foods from everywhere, a lot of fresh food. I mean, the chickens were just killed and hung there, and you could get the feet and everything to put in your soup.
And this was in Harlem.
Harlem.
At the risk of revealing your age.
Well, it will come out.
What era was this? What period?
I was born in 1943.
Okay, so wow.
I was a war baby. And, I remember when the parades came down the street, down 116th Street. It was Lenox and 16th was an avenue where a lot of people gathered. And so the big parades came. I was hanging out the window when the war was over. And they marched and, had the bands and everything, excited about that.
That's kind of exciting to actually hear about that period in Harlem, because as a writer myself, when I think of Harlem, I don't think of a multicultural. I mean, I know we had Jamaicans in Harlem. I get that. But I don't think of it in the sense of what you're speaking about. I don't think of it as that huge multicultural area where you had so many people from different walks of life and so many Caribbean people, even though I know that we had Caribbean people there. So that was really cool.
Yeah,
You
so at
know,
different times I lived all over Harlem, but in the beginning it was East Harlem and very, very multicultural. So that was beautiful. The other thing about my parents, my father was a musician, and so we were very involved in cultural activities in Harlem,
okay.
in dance, in music. My dad played all kinds of music because he was a professionally trained. As a matter of fact, he went to Alpha in
Okay,
Jamaica
in
and
Jamaica.
was an Alpha musician as a child. So
And they produce really, really good musicians. Do you play anything?
I play the guitar. I play at the guitar. I'm not very good at it. My father insisted that we all take some kind of music, and the only one he could get me to sit still for was the guitar. So he bought me a guitar, and he was always trying to get me to take lessons. I didn't take many lessons, but I play by chords, and so I still entertain myself and exercise my hands by doing that.
Okay. I
And
used to play at the guitar too, and I actually bought myself a guitar maybe about during the pandemic. Actually, I bought myself a guitar and found out that my fingers couldn't hold the chords down anymore. So
it's not easy. It
it's
really
not
isn't.
easy. It's not
Good
easy.
exercise for your hands. So, and my introduction to dance, the thing that I loved best was dance, and of course it was mambo, cha cha cha, it was calypso, it was merengue. I learned all of that as a child, and my parents said yes, I should take ballet too, so I did that also.
Wow.
Jamaican families tend to kind of insist that you study the piano, you study ballet, so that you can have proper posture and all of that.
And
And
be
so
well rounded.
yes. And
And be
so it
well
was a
rounded.
wonderful thing. And then, of course, I had so many people that actually lived in my house, in that building, in the brownstone with us. So some of them were relatives, some of them were not, because if somebody came from the island, they'd come to my parents' door and they say, so and so told me that I could come and you would help me. And they did.
A very, very Caribbean thing to do, very Jamaican thing to do. I grew up in a family like that where you just had to ask for help, and my parents were there to help you. So I totally get that. So you also, before I even get to the book, because this is about lessons for the starfish, but I think it's so important to know how you got to where you are. Um, and so you grew up in a period of the civil rights era.
I
I
did.
mean, you would have been a young adult in the civil rights era. Did you get involved in activism?
Oh, absolutely. I will tell you the thing that stands out in my mind always and is always there is the murder of Emmett Till. I
Mm,
picked up a Jet magazine. My parents really were, very focused on education. I mean, they had us reading magazines and newspapers and everything they could push on us. And I picked up the magazine that came in, the Jet magazine, and there were these two pictures, beautiful little boy, and then the mangled body that his mother received and
ooh,
had to
identify.
identify and deal with, and her pain and anguish. I recognized all that when I was 11 years old. And what struck me was this little boy is almost my age. He's the same color as me. This is what exists in America, this level of hatred. So I became, at that point, I think I became an activist then. Like I said, my parents' focus was very much on education. I knew the word college before I even went to first grade because I was going to go there someday. I had no idea exactly what it was, but I knew I needed to learn to read and write, and then maybe I would get there.
Get to
So
college.
I was very, very blessed in terms of my education. My parents searched for schools. They did not like what they saw around them in the schools in Harlem. And so they searched for somewhere that we could be educated. And they found the school called the Modern School. And that's part of my activism too. The woman that ran that school was the daughter of J. Rosamond Johnson and the
Okay.
niece, James Weldon Johnson, who wrote Lift Every
Mm,
Voice.
right.
They were the composer and the lyricist. And she was very determined that her children were going to be educated at the level that they would be able to go to any of the elite college prep
Right.
schools for any of the top colleges in the country. And when we were in 6th grade, she would go around to those schools. And at the time, integration was going on in the South. So those schools were, like kind of being put on the,
they were at the forefront.
Yeah.
They were really at the forefront.
And there were several of them in New York that sent their kids on to top colleges in the country. And she would go to those schools and she would say, I have kids that can do anything the kids here can do. You test them. If they pass your test, I want you to take them and give them scholarships because they can't pay the tuition. And so she made relationships with those schools. We ended up in those kinds of schools, basically integrating them ourselves. And then I ended up at Barnard College when I applied to schools. That's the women's undergraduate at Columbia University.
Let me roll you back just a second. Roll you back to when you talk about Emmett Till, because here we are at the time of this recording in 2023, a 6-year-old boy was just murdered because he's an Arab, because he's a Palestinian American. A 6-year-old American boy was just murdered because he's a Palestinian American. Yeah. And so it seems almost that where you were back then in the 60s, it's almost as if we're back there. And I don't want to get into politics. I just want to talk about how discrimination and how the policies of the day and how the atmosphere we currently have in America, how common they are, and how that then led you into education. Because according to your book, Lessons from a Starfish, you realized that education was the thing that really levels us all. The lack of educational opportunities and racial oppression and the connection between that and discrimination. And we've seen it in our education system, where there are certain schools that are given less resources than other schools based on where they are. And that kind of led you into your path of education.
Yes, and even here in the North, at the time we were focused on desegregation of schools in the South because the schools treated Black students so unfairly, and the schools that were segregated, of course, did not get the resources that schools for white children did. So, but that went on in the North too. As we looked around at the schools in Harlem, we could see that. So when I was at Barnard and all that was going on in the South, there were many students that left Barnard and went south to work
in activism.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it was students all over the country that really were the engine of that civil rights movement.
Did Marcus Garvey have any influence on you as we talk about Harlem?
Absolutely. Some of my family belonged to the Marcus Garvey movement in Cuba, and some of them belonged to it in Jamaica. And so, that was very much a part of my DNA too, was Marcus Garvey and his desire for Black people to make the connection to Africa, that we didn't just start, our history didn't start here. We come from a very, 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 very old cultures and cultures that have really done a lot for the world.
I'm pretty sure you've heard me do my piece, Our History Did Not Begin with Slavery.
Absolutely.
Yes, I have a piece that I wrote and I do about the fact that we come from amazing cultures way before slavery, and that slavery, as horrifying as it was 400 years of thousands and thousands of years, thousands of years. Anyway, I want to move on and get to your book. So lessons, because we could actually talk about this stuff. Yeah, we could talk about this stuff all day, but I want to talk about Lessons from a Starfish. Hold up your book so everybody can see your book, because I don't have the printed copy with me. So it's Lessons from Starfish. Beautiful cover, beautiful title. And as an educator, I won't tell them, you tell everyone why the title. What is a starfish? What does that mean to you?
And I would like to do that, Judith, if I may, by reading a story that I did not write, but that really it really brought the meaning of the starfish story into my writing this book. So the story goes like this. It was written by a man named Loren Isley, an anthropologist and educator. One day, a man was walking along the beach when he noticed a boy picking something up and gently throwing it into the ocean. Approaching the boy, he asked, "What are you doing?" The boy replied, "Throwing starfish back into the ocean. The surf is up and the tide's going out. If I don't throw them back, they'll die." "Son," the man said, "don't you realize there are miles and miles of beach and hundreds of starfish? You can't make a difference." After listening politely, the boy bent down, picked up another starfish, and threw it back into the surf. Then, smiling at the man, he said, "I made a difference for that one." So I heard that story. I first heard that story. I'm going to read a little excerpt from the book as to how I first heard that story and what it meant to me. One spring, while I was teaching fifth grade in Moreno Valley, California, our superintendent held a professional development conference. He wanted to impress upon us the idea that the parents in our community were sending their best children for us to teach. They were not hiding their best at home and sending us the rest. He wanted us to receive all children with optimism and resolve to teach them as they were, not as we would want them to be. He introduced the keynote speaker, explaining to us that she had been selected as the National Teacher of the Year because of her success with children who weren't usually successful in school. Her classroom was located in a storefront. We learned during the presentation that her students were all homeless children who lived in circumstances that made it extremely difficult for them to focus on their studies. They were subject to hunger, stress, untreated illnesses of many kinds, loss, sorrow, distrust, and sometimes abuse. And yet, this was a teacher who found ways to help most of her students make significant academic progress, and that was the reason for her award. While the name of this extraordinary teacher has faded from my memory, her message is as sharp and clear in my mind today as it was when I first heard it. Every learner is a precious gift to a real teacher. The true craft of the teacher is honed in the passionate desire to teach the learner who is most challenged. From this marvelous teacher, I heard the story of the starfish for the first time. What I heard this exemplary teacher say was that every single student mattered and that she did her best to make a difference for a child every day that she taught. My response to the ideas I heard that day was a resolve to figure out which of my children every year seemed to really need my extra efforts and attention as a teacher, and to make sure that I was giving extra thought to ways that I could enhance their educational experience and make a difference in their lives. I called these students my starfish, and what I found was that these were indeed the students who helped me the most to improve my craft as a teacher. By trying to make a difference for each of them, I became a better teacher for all of my students.
And I'm sure impacted your life too.
Right. That's why lessons from Starfish.
So your starfish, I want to talk about Sandy and the bubble bath. Because in this book, you have so many examples of things you learned from your starfish. And Sandy and the bubble bath is one of those stories. Without reading it, tell us about Sandy and the bubble bath, because I thought that one was very interesting.
Okay. Sandy was a student that came into my classroom at a time when I felt like I had really, set my classroom up well to receive new students. And, like we were doing things to be a team. Right. I had my students believe that we were all a team together. I was learning from them. They were learning from me and so forth. And Sandy came into the classroom. You always feel like if you set things up right, that a kid that comes in is going to kind of, like fit in. No, Sandy came in and she was the poutiest. I thought she was the most disagreeable child I had ever met. So, I tried to work along with it and get her acclimated to our classroom. And the thing that worried me the most was that she didn't get along with the other students, that she seemed to find ways to make herself disagreeable to them. And, I didn't mind if she was relatively respectful to me. And I didn't mind if I was going to have to deal with the challenges. Well, please don't disrupt my classroom.
Don't disrupt my classroom.
Right. So finally, her parents didn't come to the the first conference. And finally, I said to myself, I've got to talk with the parents. I need to find out what makes this kid tick. I'm always looking for a hook that would help me to connect to a child. So I asked her mom. Her mom said she would come to a conference, and she would bring Sandy, but it had to be late in the day because she didn't have somebody to pick up the other kids and so forth. It was a big family. And so I said, fine. And so we arranged a late conference. And I asked her, please bring Sandy with you because I want us to talk together and find out what will help Sandy to really thrive in my classroom. So they came in, mom came through the door, and I didn't see Sandy, and I started to ask for her, and I heard her yell, Sandy, get on in here. It's Coleman wants to talk. So we sat down. Sandy slumped down in a seat like she wasn't going to participate at all.
In her usual fashion.
Yeah. And her mom, talked about, why it is that she can't be a good student. And, she's always telling her that she needs to be an example. She's one of the older kids. And so finally, we weren't getting anywhere, and Sandy looked like she wasn't even listening. And I asked her, I said, Sandy, what are you really interested in? What interests you? Can you tell me that? And then I knew that she did read. She liked to read. That was her best time of the day, when she was reading by herself, writing by herself. So I said, well, what would interest you? She says, well, I like to read a nice story about somebody who's doing something new, something, interesting, going somewhere nice. And so I said, oh, yeah. So she was always reading the adventure books. I said, oh, yeah, I noticed you read adventure books. And she said, yeah, that's what I like. So then I said, and what about when you're at home? What do you like to do there? And she pouted and she looked at her mom, and then she went, I like bubble baths. And her mother looked like she was going to go ballistic, bubble bath, that has nothing to do. Miss Coleman is talking about you doing what she tells you to do. And so I said, well, let me ask you, Sandy, what is it about bubble baths that you like? And
what is there not to like about bubble baths?
Well, I just want her to explain. She said she liked to go in the bathroom and nobody's rushing you out, and she can take a nice bath and be in the warm water and so forth and so on. And so I said, well, is that something that if we could work toward you having bubble baths, is that something that you would work toward? And we could set up a little system where you get points for the things that you do in the classroom, and that goes home to your mom. And then you all can have a system for bubble baths as a reward, an incentive. Her mom was not happy with the idea, but I said to her, she asked her, she said, well, Sandy, would that really make you do what you're supposed to do? And she said, yeah, Ma, I would really try hard.
It's interesting to see what incentives move different people, because it would never cross my mind that a bubble bath would be an incentive.
And her mom said, we have one bathroom, we have a lot of people. And I said, well, maybe you could figure out what would be a time when there would be a half an hour and Sandy would be able to be in there and she wouldn't be disturbing anybody else. That little girl worked like crazy to get her bubble bath.
Bubble bath.
Got that first bubble bath. She was so excited. And then we had a connection. So that's the thing that I try to get across for parents and teachers and everybody that works with kids. It's so important to try to find out where they're coming from. What's in their mind, not just what we want to shove in. Kids are a captive audience in school. They don't come there, a lot of them, because they really want to be there.
No.
Parents come to teachers because they want something that, they feel they need something, or adults do. But when children come, they have to come. And so we need to find out, what it is, what connection can we make with what they're interested in.
So the lesson you learned from Sandy was that you have to be able to find that connection, what that connection is. Right. And throughout your life as an educator, which was a long and very, very varied life in terms of all the places you taught and all the things you taught, you learned different lessons from your different starfish. And Sandy stood out to me because I just thought, who'd think a bubble bath would be the thing? I can think of so many other things that I would have behaved for, but a bubble bath, how do you, as an educator, And you talk about this in your book, Lessons from a Starfish. The book we're talking about is Lessons from a Starfish. This is Dr. Juanita Coleman-Merritt. We just call her Juana for short. And she's talking about her new book, Lessons from a Starfish. And in Lessons from a Starfish, you talk about being able to manage, even though you may have 25 to 30 kids in a class, how you actually are able to identify the ones that need the most help and how you help them without actually neglecting the others.
Right.
And
that is, teaching for all children, in spite of the fact that you have a group, is something that teacher training schools have been doing more with. That wasn't necessarily something that I learned in teacher training, but maybe I did, in the sense that the very first experience I had teaching was in a classroom where a teacher taught 3-year-olds, and she was marvelous with those 3-year-olds. I was an intern in that classroom, and I remember being so surprised what she could do. But what I think you have to do is just realize these are people that we're teaching, not the subject matter alone. We have to notice the people. When I went to one conference, and one of the things that I learned there was try to greet each child individually in the morning. Like, be at the door. Don't just be in the classroom and they all come in and it's kind of like, a hodgepodge. Be at the door. Look each kid in the eye. Sometimes you can see that something's wrong, or that you can see they're especially happy. I asked them to, I would tell my students every year, you're going to decide what greeting you're going to give me in the morning. It can be a high five, a low five. It can be a thumbs up. It can be a handshake. It can be a hug if you want. And so what happened was every kid would come to the door and they'd have to do a greeting with me. And it worked because I would see things about kids as they came into the classroom. And that was like one of the things that I did. Also, the fact that I would tell them that I'm a student here too. I'm trying to learn from you. Mm-hmm. We need interaction. When we're, for example, a lot of times you throw out a question to the classroom and you call on the kid that raises their hand. Well, the same kids usually raise their hand.
Yep, they usually do.
And they want to show that they're, and so you can do cold call, which is, I call on somebody just because, there's maybe an expression on their face or something that makes me think maybe they would have something to say. I was a very shy child in school, even though I loved school and I usually was on top of my learning, but I did not raise my hand at all in school.
So you're one of the people that had to be called on, so to speak. Exactly. What I love about the book, Lessons from a Starfish, is that even though it's about your experience as a teacher, it's not just about teaching. It's about learning. It's about people. And it's easy to read. A lot of times you get books that are written by educators and you need to have a dictionary beside you or thesaurus beside you while you're reading it, because, some of the language is not meant for just lay people. But Lessons from a Starfish is actually just meant for everybody, because these are lessons that are relevant to just people, relationships, period.
Right.
They're not just lessons that are about children. What is one of the stories that stands out for you? Because Sandy stood out for me. What's one of the stories that stands out for you?
Well, obviously, these are kids that stayed in my mind because I wrote the book after I retired, and there were lots and lots of them. It's just that I picked 7 that would kind of illustrate some of the most important things I felt that I learned that made me be able to serve the needs of a lot of children. I will mention Petey. Petey was a child that there was a time when teachers were the monitors on the yard. We were teaching all day long.
I know. I taught for a while. I get it.
Right. So in those days, and I taught in the South for a while, and there were no teachers unions, and so teachers did everything. In any case, so Petey was one of those children that when you were monitoring on the yard, you noticed, because he was always into something. And so I noticed him from 2nd grade out there on the yard and saw him coming my way. I taught 5th grade for a very long time. And so at the time I was teaching 5th grade and I saw him coming my way. And the teachers used to sit with say all the third grade teachers sit with the third grade students' folders and kind of dish them out to make the classes sort of even, so that one person didn't get all the kids that had one kind of problem, right, and then more boys than girls and those kinds of considerations. And so we're going through the folders for the fifth grade, and they go, Petey, and and everybody's looking around. And I went, I'll take him. I said, that'll be my Starfish for this year. Well, he was one of those students that he had an odd way of, he was kind of a leader of kids, and he had an odd way of just doing whatever it was. He was a very spontaneous type of child. And when I first got him in the classroom, he was trying to be very, very intentional about being good and doing what I asked the students to do. And gradually that kind of, faded because of the kind of person he was. So in any case, I said to Petey one day, I said, Petey, it's time for you to write silently and read silently. And I want to see you doing that, because if not, I'm going to have to move your desk. Put it next to mine so that I can. Well, next thing I knew, Petey had a marble in his hand and he's trying to get it to another kid. And he's saying, you check, catch it. And I look at him, I give him my evil eye, I raise my eyebrow, he's just doing what he's doing. So I said, all right, Petey, silent reading time. You're going to have to move your desk. Petey jumped up. Okay, Miss Coleman, I got it. And he's moving kids, and he's getting the kids to move out of the way so he could move his desk over next to mine. And suddenly I realized he wanted to be there. So what we think may be a bad consequence may not be for a kid. And so, and so that year I just really learned a lot from Petey. And one of the things that I found out about him was that he really liked me a lot. He did, when I had his father in to talk with me about ways that we could help him, his father told me he hasn't got a mom at home. And he would hug me in the morning. He was one of the boys.
He was looking for a mom.
So when I spoke with his father, then I realized, he said his mom had come from an Indian reservation, and she had decided that she could not live, like in the city where he lived, and she went back home and left Petey with him. Wow. And so he was raising him alone. And that's why Petey often came to school, didn't look washed. His clothes were sometimes too small, his hair wasn't combed, and so forth. So what I learned from Petey was kind of unconditional regard, and the really important fact that you have to intentionally, as a teacher, let the children that you work with know that you care about them as a person. It's not automatic. We sometimes think that all these kids, will know that we mean them well, but not necessarily so, and it was kind of like I had to show that extra care to Petey, so that he would want to do some of the things that he needed to do.
Right. So you have to be kind of intentional. What are some of the other lessons that you've learned over the years that anyone who is listening, who's a teacher or who just works with children, really should know?
Yeah. Sometimes we have certain rules in our classroom and ways of doing things, and it doesn't work for some child. I'm
one of those. Okay. I'm one of those that the rules just did not work for. I knew what they were, and it wasn't, I should put it this way. Let me rephrase that. Rules that made no sense. The kind of, I was the girl who you couldn't say because I said so. Because I said so was never a reason for me to do anything. In fact, if you wanted me to not do it, just add because I said so. Because that's not reason.
Being a Jamaican child, I'm sure you heard that a lot, because I did hear it. Because I said so. I don't need to explain myself.
We were raised with because I said so. And so my dad and I would get into it all the time, constantly, because I needed to know why you said so. I mean, what's the point? I had the same problem doing math. I was terrible. I was good at math until I got to about 9th grade. And then they started doing things like trigonometry and add math and all this crap. And I really was offended because you'd give me a formula and just tell me to use it, and you can't tell me why this
Yeah.
formula needs to be used. You can't tell me anything except to do it because I said so. So I am one of those students who, I wouldn't say that I didn't follow all the rules, but if you explain to me the purpose, then it made a difference. And I raised my kids that way. I didn't just do the because I said so. I would tell you why you need to do something and what the consequences of not doing it would be, so that you would make a rational decision to do the thing.
Absolutely.
So I do get that there are things that you set up in a classroom. And I taught for a while. I'm an educator because I taught high school for a while, but I also was a trainer, corporate trainer. I've worked with students for a long time through various organizations, including Jamaica Youth for Christ. And I do training. So in many ways, I'm also an educator. But I do get that you will always have those kids who just, the rules that you've set up for this classroom just don't apply to everyone.
Yeah. I had one student that I was asked to take. He had actually punched his principal in a school and was about put out of the school district entirely and sent to a state school. And you can imagine what kind of exposure that would give to a child. 11 years old, and his principal brought him to me and said, I would like you to take this child. I'll tell you everything about him, but I think together we would be able to help him finish 5th grade and not go to a state school. And so we did work. And I found that I had to bend some rules. I had to work with a counselor. At that time, we had the Healthy Start program, and we had counselors from USC, student counselors, who would come and work with our children. And so when the counselor asked me to do some things that I normally would not do in my classroom, like let him sit by himself, I always did group work. I like the kids to be together. And there were some things that I had to adjust in my classroom in order to serve that child's needs. And at the same time, still, make sure that he was still fitting in with the students. So I did allow him to sit in a special place, but at the same time, I would say, when there is time for group work, and then I would have somebody kind of monitor him doing group work with other students, that I will ask you to come and I expect you to be able. And he loved it, that he was sitting in this special place by the window.
Special place. Who doesn't like being special? Everybody likes being special.
He needed that. And, he did end up graduating from 5th grade.
Great. Fantastic. So as a retired educator, when you look on the school system today, and we look at teachers who are struggling, literally struggling in classrooms, in a lot of places, the resources are not there. They are taking resources out of their own pockets and their own means. They are struggling with different issues today, social media, bullying in a completely different way using social media. They're struggling with a lot of things. They're struggling with active shooter drills, all kinds of things. Our students are under siege. I call it a siege. Mentally, emotionally, our students are under siege in America. Not necessarily everywhere. There's a different kind of siege on in some parts of Jamaica too. It seems to be almost everywhere that students are facing completely different challenges from what you and I had to face, and so require completely different approaches. As a retired educator who spent years in the system helping to build that system and hone that system, fighting against discrimination and advocating for children, what is your word of advice to an educator today who is just coming into the system or halfway through their tenure? And what is your word of advice as we get closer to wrapping this up on Lessons from a Starfish?
Well, I have to say that, yes, things have changed tremendously. Technology is in the classrooms and in our homes with our students now, and it can make such a tremendous difference. I think that teachers have to really put their hearts into learning how to use the technology that can help us to educate our children. At the same time, we need to realize that a lot of times that technology can make us even more distant from our students. We saw that during COVID. A lot of the reason for some of the low achievement that we're finding now from students, our students across the country, has been that they've suddenly had to use technology. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'll tell you, when I was in the classroom, I was hoping that we would train our teachers and bring that technology in, because especially in our low income communities, our kids were falling behind. There were schools that were just had technology everywhere, and kids would do all kinds of things with it. And kids in our low income communities would have maybe 2 or 3 computers in a classroom and a computer lab down the way that they went to.
I can tell you about that, because when my kids were in high school, they opened a new high school 5 miles down the road, 5-6 miles down the road. There was a dividing line, and the kids from this side of the dividing line went to that new high school. Of course, it was brand new, so it had state-of-the-art everything. But the school my kids went to was still struggling with, computers since the dinosaurs. And it was fortunate that we had a principal who stood up to the school board and who insisted, and he fought hard. And he was like, you can't teach people 5 minutes down the road with brand new equipment and expect now that I should get results with this old equipment. It's not like my students can choose to go there. Because of the dividing line, you've creamed off half of my crop, sent them to that school, and now I'm fighting and my students are fighting. And he was able to get that. So, that use of technology, having somebody who advocates, who is going to fight for our students, is important. And I think that we garner a lot of that from Lessons from a Starfish. It is such an easy to read book with such wonderful, heartwarming stories of a teacher who cared and who still cares, and who found a way to reach each and every one of her students in the best way she could, which is you, in the best way that you could. You found this way.
Right.
Pardon?
I said, you have to work with what you've got. And that's one thing I will say, in terms of advice for people who are in the classroom. We know that it is very difficult. Our society needs to recognize the difficulty that our schools are having, that the schools need a great deal of support. Proper compensation for teachers is important, because we have a shortage of teachers across the country. So,
across the world.
I would like to inspire people. I would like to inspire everybody to really insist upon the resources that these teachers and students need in our school. This is our greatest treasure, the minds of our youth. And so I really would like to, the fact that teachers are not compensated, paid, means that a lot of young people will not want to become teachers. You can't really blame them, but it is such a rewarding and exciting profession that I want to encourage people who think that they would like to be teachers to still consider being teachers and maybe take some inspiration. Relationships are still the key. Even if we're using technology and so forth, we cannot get distant from our students. I think if we still strive to make those connections, that we are going to achieve the educational outcomes that we would like for our kids.
And that's it, folks. Inspiration from Lessons from a Starfish. Pull that book up again one more time, Juana, so we can see it. Whoops. There you go. Lessons from a Starfish. And to everybody if you're a teacher, if you're an educator of any kind, find your starfish. I think that's the lesson I took from this book. And I have, over the years, I never thought of them as starfish, never really did. But after I read this book, I sat down and I thought of all the young people whose lives I impacted, who turned around and said, you did this, you did that, and I'm here because you did X and you did Y and because you cared. And I think it's very important that we look at our young people today and realize that they need us to care, and to find the ones who really need us to step up and be there for them and treat them like that starfish, and save the one starfish at a time, putting them back into the ocean. One, I want to say thanks a million for being on Shelf Life. I've thoroughly enjoyed our chat. I wish you all the success with Lessons from a Starfish. And folks, I'm encouraging you to get the the book. It is not a book about teaching. It's a book about children. It's a book about relationships. It's a book that has lessons for all of us. The book, again, is Lessons from a Starfish, available wherever you would buy your books, on Amazon and all the various platforms. Thank you very much again, Juana. You've been watching Shelf Life. I'll catch you next time.
Thank you for allowing me to share.
Blessings.